I'm curious what your experience of New Zealand does.
You know, I still use that trip in my writing. I last year wrote a piece about polyglotism, I guess you could say. And when I was in New Zealand, I happened to see in one of the hotel rooms I stayed in a news report on the Chinese language, Mandarin, which I also study, and I know one or both of you do as well, being introduced in certain schools. I think this was in like Rotorua. It was not a big town, but the news anchor reporting the segment asked a teacher, in all seriousness, I detected no joking, no irony whatsoever. She said, "Well, aren't you afraid their little brains would explode?" That stuck with me, and I was like, well, I guess that is an attitude. This is still the Anglosphere, and there's still a concern that if you teach more than one language to a kid, their brain may well explode.
Yeah.
But I'm not saying that was representative of New Zealand attitudes I encountered, but it was a bit dreamlike. I never quite got away from knowing that there were only 4 million people there. It never felt. And 20 million sheep, so I was always seeing them on the side of the road, and my mind was on driving on the other side and noticing the little details. But I enjoyed it. I would go back, but it's not the easiest time to go to New Zealand, as I understand it.
Yeah, no, I've talked to Simon about this quite a lot, just in terms of my own relationship with New Zealand now that I'm back here, and going over to the big wide world. Speaking Japanese, learning Chinese, sort of very interested in different languages, and sort of coming back and developing this kind of pidgin mix of different languages that I use with my friends, and then sort of remembering that the rest of New Zealand, in a lot of cases is, they don't really kind of connect with that idea, and there's this whole other world out there, and then there's sort of my memories of growing up in small town New Zealand, and it's sort of two different worlds.
The East Asians who go to New Zealand, why are they there? The sort of Japanese people or Chinese people whom you meet in New Zealand, what brings them there?
Oh, there's a lot of different reasons. I'm in Wellington at the moment, and so it's quite a cosmopolitan place, and I think people come here, it's the nature, kind of trying something new, getting away from wherever they were. And I find in particular Auckland is a little bit more specific. People come here to kind of, do business or study or whatnot. But Wellington, it kind of attracts the random kind of people of the world. Like it is quite an eclectic mix.
I could see that. I liked Wellington.
Yeah, I've got an on and off relationship with it, as many people know. It's sort of a small place. It's like not quite a real city. It's sort of just a little bit smaller than that, and so it's still got a local vibe. But there is definitely what we call the tall poppy syndrome here, where it's kind of like if you've gone and done something overseas, it's kind of null and void. And
I see. You have to start over, square one.
Yeah. So I've struggled with that, and it's been sort of a double life in a way, trying to like be a local but also not.
What brought you back to New Zealand? I've heard a few episodes of the show, but not one where you've addressed why you came back.
I had been coming back in the summertime for a while, and just the last time I was like, okay, stuff happening over in Wuhan doesn't really look that great. I had a cousin actually who was at Wuhan University at that time, and she was like, oh, it's going to be okay, don't worry about it. And I was like, oh, yeah, I don't know, like you might want to you might want to come back. So we just sort of held fire because we were about to head off again, but we just stayed here and ended up taking the long haul for 2 years. And it's been instructive to say the least. But yeah, that's me. But I am keen to find out a little bit more about yourself, Colin.
Anything.
You're in South Korea at the moment.
I've lived in Seoul for 6 years now.
Wow.
In November went over to 6 years, which it sounds long, but I meet expats here who have been here 20, 30 years, many of whom still can't speak Korean.
Do you find there's a lot of foreigners over there who can't speak Korean? Because I found a lot, when I was there in, I think, 2012, there was a lot of lifers, like you say. They'd been there for 14 years, 15 years, and they didn't speak a lick of Korean. And it was quite interesting, right?
Well, interesting is one way of putting it. I was at a party a few years ago, an English radio party. There is an English language radio world here in Seoul. It's very small, but it exists. And I was guesting on a segment about Seoul urbanism for a while. I was at this party. One of English radio's biggest stars, a Canadian guy, was chatting with him. And I happened to mention I'd been studying the Korean language for about 7 years before I came to Korea. And he actually stopped the party. He turned everyone toward me. He's like, hey, This guy was studying Korean before he came to Korea, and I was thinking, does this shit happen in China? I don't think it does. The Korean expat community, such as it is distinguished, you could say, by the number of people who don't speak Korean. And for my own part, I can't imagine how they get by. I can't imagine. Before I ever visited Korea, you get the impression, you're sort of given to believe that Koreans, as soon as they see a white face, will try English. And that's happened to me maybe 10 times in 6 years I've been addressed in English. It's Koreans speak Korean, and if you don't have it, it's a hard road to hoe. But I mean, as I'm sure you saw, many long-term expats, they find a way. They just go to places where English is spoken, or their wife does everything for them, or they sort of, like a river finds the easiest path down the mountain, they also find the easiest way through Korea without bothering to learn more than taxi and restaurant Korean, if that. But as to why it is, I've never lived in Japan. I've been there many times, and I love when I go there. The expectation is in the air. Even as a foreigner, you're going to speak Japanese. That's my impression anyway. I've never been to China. I've been to Taiwan and started studying Mandarin before going there for that reason. But I get the sense on the mainland you're going to feel that pressure. You'd better be speaking Chinese if you want to stay here any length of time. In Korea, no one's really putting. If anybody's putting the pressure on you, it's got to be you yourself, right?
I think, like from my experience in Japan, I didn't necessarily feel that pressure a lot, but I wanted to learn Japanese. I took it upon myself, and I feel like a lot of foreigners in Japan do want to do it for themselves, their own sort of like intrinsic.
The interest is there.
Yeah, the interest there is there because of the the cultural aspect of Japan's history. I guess fascinates people more possibly than it does in Korea. I'm not sure.
Oh, certainly.
I think it probably says something about the kind of people that go to Korea. Like, I don't know what it's like anymore, of course, and I don't know what your experience is. But when I was there, it was just English teachers who wanted to party, and that is what we did.
Well, you were a teacher yourself, right?
I was an English teacher who wanted to party. Exactly.
Well, that tells you, it shows you that there are two worlds at least among expats. There's English teachers, and then everyone else. And it's hard to cross the line between those worlds, especially, as I understand it, if you're a teacher trying to break out of it. It's not so easy, is it?
It is hard. Are you saying that there's a lot of, I guess, professional Waegukins in Korea, and Waegukin being the term for foreigner?
Yeah. Derived from the same Chinese characters as the better-known Gaikokujin in Japan as well. But outside country person. Yeah, there are, and it's been kind of an issue for me, because if you are a professional Waegugin, you have the roads are limited to ensure your visa status. Something that I've sort of struggled with myself. If you don't want to teach English or whatever language you speak natively, the other option is, if you speak Korean, to go on TV. And I've got offers, and I've got around them for the most part. I have gone on TV, but to get a long-term visa, I may have to come to terms with the fact that I'll be going on TV sooner rather than later. So I'm trying to accept that and figuring out how to become not the sort of performing foreigner. Because a lot of foreigners who speak Korean are on TV for that reason and that reason only. Whereas in Japan, I think the standards are higher. You can speak Japanese. You have to speak Japanese if you want to go on TV in Japan, but you have to do something else as well, right? And there's a famous gaijin whom I quite admire and take as a model in some ways, Peter Barakan in Japan, who does a show. He does many broadcasting activities, but one show, The Lifestyle Museum on Tokyo FM, that I listen to every week. And, he's English and he speaks Japanese. He's been there more than 40 years. And he just interviews people, Japanese people or Japanese-speaking foreigners on this show every week. And he brings a different perspective, of course. But to my mind, nothing is lacking about his Japanese. He speaks it just as well as a Japanese, but he never sort of forgets to use the fact that he's English and draw on his sort of Western experience as well. And there's no one quite like that in Korea. Maybe I can fashion a role of that kind, but we'll see. I've got a long way to go before I'm Peter Barakan.
That's fascinating. I guess talking about performance, I am interested in this idea of like the performance of the self, right? And and how, especially when you're living overseas in a place like South Korea or Japan, you kind of begin to embody everything about where it is that you're from, and you start to become representative of that. How have you found that and where you are?
Well, it's tricky in my case because nobody ever guesses that I'm American. For whatever reason, people are thrown off by that. When they find out, they always say something to the effect of, like, I never would have guessed. And I don't know what they're drawing on. Sometimes this will happen. I'll order a coffee, and I'll come back to pick up the coffee. The buzzer they give me goes off. I go to get it, and I see one or more baristas sort of clustered there, asking, where are you from? We were wondering. And something about me, it scrambles the signal a bit. They're looking for certain characteristics in an American that I don't deliver in one way or another. I mean, and have you both been? I know. One of you have, of course, lived in Korea. Have you both been to Korea and sort of had that dynamic happen where they take you as a representative?
I was only there for a couple of days in Seoul, and so I can't say. I mean, it was quite an interesting experience, but I can't say I had that much engagement with people, so it's hard to say. But I'd imagine if I spent longer there, it might have come out. Yes.
And were you the Simon? Were you the Yongguk Shinsa here in Korea?
I was very much the British guy. I was the cliche British guy, the gentleman. That happened in Japan as well. Especially older Japanese men were like, "Are you a gentleman?
Are you a gentleman?" Yes, very important question.
They were fascinated by British culture.
I find it interesting hearing you mention that stuff, Colin, because being back in New Zealand now for 2 years and in very much a globalized place, even though Wellington is a small city in a way, I found it very relaxing to kind of come back and be able to just be myself in a way. There's no a priori ideas of who or what I am. And, talking with my friends, my colleague is from China, and, we speak Chinese sometimes, or we just use these kind of pidgin languages again, which I really love, mixing English and Chinese and Japanese all in one. And it's like, it doesn't matter. It's just who we are. But when I was in Japan, or when I've traveled overseas, you take all of this baggage with you and you kind of embody it. And there's expectations and ideas that kind of precede you. And I didn't realize at the time, but how much that had affected the way I presented and performed, I guess, within society.
Do the Japanese have a strong mental image of the New Zealander you were held to?
Well, just anyone who's not Japanese, there's ideas.
Of course.
And so, and looking back on that, I found that, despite that, my kind of opportunity to develop my creative practice kind of emerged through that. But at the same time, it can be quite challenging to be faced with this, these ideas of kind of broad strokes of people and not looking at the individual.
I could see that, having to play a role even if you're not on TV. If you are on TV, I imagine they really ask you to camp it up. Be from wherever you are to the nth degree, and that would be difficult. That would be unnatural, I suspect.
Yeah, and it's kind of almost a projection, though, of, I guess, maybe their feelings or their kind of their kind of subconscious ideas of themselves. And I find this always very interesting. This kind of idea of identity in place. And the connection between different parts of Asia and kind of that kind of cultural mix and how it all kind of comes out in different ways and how it becomes politicized as well is very interesting. What's your experience been with that?
Well, politicized in what sense? In terms of a particular issue, or like geopolitics as they manifest in day-to-day life?
Well, I'll give you a little example. So my wife is Japanese, but we have I've spent a lot of time with her family, and her grandmother grew up in Takeda, which is a place in Japan that's very well known for the Zainichi Korean population. And we have you can just talk to her, and you can find this kind of, I don't know, it feels like you can see the connection with Korea there. And, she's never said anything about it, but with her grandmother, I can see that connection. And so to say, do you have, Korean connection in the family somewhere? It's not really able to be spoken about. Yeah, it's very clear to me that she's got the body language, she's got everything. And it's like, there's something there, which I find very interesting, and we love it. But when you're in Japan, it becomes you can't ask that question.
I do find the Zainichi Koreans I've encountered in Japan, usually they've lost their linguistic roots in any case and can barely speak Korean. Sometimes they, but last I was in Osaka, I was at a Tigers bar, a Hanshin Tigers bar, being run by a guy who volunteered. He was ethnically Korean. And I was saying, "Oh, do you speak any Korean?" And all he knew was kimuchi. And he said it that way. He said it kimuchi, with the full accent and everything, which I enjoyed. So we just used Japanese, crappy though my Japanese is. But here, I mean, if you look at it the other way, there were protests a couple of years ago, known as the No Japan protests in Korea. This was pre-corona. Turning against, once again, sort of a flare-up of anti-Japanese sentiment. But that sentiment exists with an appreciation for pretty much everything Japanese. Even among the oldest generations who experience firsthand what it was to live under Japanese rule, to the extent that I talk to people of that generation, they still express just instinctive appreciation for, you can tell they think Japanese things are, by definition, the best. And oftentimes their speech is littered with Japanese words, and they don't... often they don't know that they don't know that they are. And it's... I don't know how much I should point that out or not, or whether I should acknowledge that when I talk to them. I make a mental note, but you're never quite sure in Korea how you can discuss Japan. But I take Japanese classes here. I've taken a variety of conversation classes. There's always Koreans there that are always eager to learn Japanese, and they may express they may say we don't like the Japanese government, but the anti-Japanism doesn't run that deep, I suspect, though it is highly visible in situations like these No Japan protests. It's easy to encounter anti-Japanese sentiment, but not so easy to encounter a Korean who really avoids Japanese things.
Back when I was living in Brighton in 2011, so this was before I went to Korea, I was working as an English teacher. This is where my career started. So I was teaching in a private school in Brighton, and we had students from all over the world, mostly Europe, but we had quite a lot of Japanese and quite a lot of Koreans in the school. And this is where I sort of met a lot of my first Koreans. And then so in one class we would have 6 Japanese and 6 Koreans, and they got on really well. Like they struck up great friendships. And it came time for Korean Independence Day, which I believe is August 6th. Is that right? Is it?
There's a few different holidays, but there is one in August as well.
So it was one of the Korean Independence Days, and that is independence from Japan after the war. So on this particular day, all the Koreans in the school were very excited and very happy, and they were drinking, eating loads. And so some of the Japanese were like, congratulations for today. By the way, what is today for your culture? And the Koreans said, well, it's our Independence Day. And the Japanese were like, independence from who? And they just didn't know. They just honestly didn't know.
I just went in and checked, by the way, so I didn't get it wrong. It's August 15th. Now we can freely say what date it was. I was afraid of saying the wrong day. That would not have reflected well on me. But that's a telling story. It's a very telling story. This is the example that comes up so often is Dokdo, known as Takeshima in Japanese, the island between Korea and Japan, which is used as a sort of political symbol. And there are many Koreans who express great fervor about Dokdo. Dokdo nun uritang. Dokdo is our land. And I have yet to meet a Japanese who cares, and most of them haven't heard of this issue. I mean, it's a one-way rivalry, you might say. There are Japanese people who resent Korea's popularity in the world, but I don't get the sense that the Japanese hate Koreans, or unless they're Koreans in their midst and they resent them, if you know what I mean. There's no generalized hatred of the kind that you would expect if you know about Korean anti-Japanese sentiment, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Wow, it's all very interesting. And again, hearing you talk about it sort of takes me back a little bit, because as I said, I go to, I've got a few friends we met up with, and it is, we all are from different backgrounds and we all speak different languages, and all of this stuff seems to just evaporate away. But I do recall when I was living overseas in Japan that a lot of this was so much more, in your face and visible. and you could feel it. And now that has sort of disappeared in a way, as because New Zealand functionally is such a globalized and open society, that it's kind of you can do whatever you want and anyone can kind of come along, and that's okay. And it sort of promotes this kind of mingling and curiosity in a way, if you know what I mean. Whereas that wasn't the case in Japan or other places I've been, where it can be very knee-jerk and polarized and black and white.
And it can be, and you have those sound trucks as well, with the ultra-conservatives blaring their messages outside of off the speakers off the back of a truck. You don't miss those, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, I do recall those, and they are quite loud. But kind of breaking through that layer though, because for me it is, the political is always, it's so salient right now, just with everything going on in the world. But I do always think, coming back to the practice and my artwork, and then kind of collaborating to create things that trying to break through those barriers and looking at the connection between what artists and creators are doing in different places. One example is, I'm a big fan of Park Chan-wook's films.
Yes.
And looking at the connection and the synergy between that and, say, earlier avant-garde Japanese cinema, and kind of this kind of give and take between these artists, who I'm sure there's a high degree of mutual respect between all of these practitioners. Yet the work itself is, each iteration, no matter who it comes from, seems more polished than the previous.
It's true. Korean cinema in these past 10 years, there's been some attempts to collaborate with Western actors, Western production companies, and all that, to varying degrees of success. Park Chan-wook, was Stoker one of his?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's right. And that was one of the more successful entries in the sort of East-West collaboration. One of the less successful would be, Bong Joon-ho is a good example, because he's been so lauded for Gisaeng-chung, Parasite, which won the U.S. Academy Awards, swept those in last year. But before that, he made Okja, which was this sort of half and half thing. And I think I haven't seen worse performances by Western movie stars in recent memory than I did in Okja. Something, it's one of these Korean movies where something goes wrong in the collaboration with the West, and after that, Bong Joon-ho returned to the homeland and sort of mounted an attack on the homeland in a way, but it was much more successful critically and artistically, I would say. But, there's others. There's interesting filmmakers who do more regional collaborations as well. There's a Chinese, how to put it, a Korean Chinese, or he was born in China, but he's ethnically Korean. Zhang Lu is his name, and he makes films mostly in Korean, but his last one was in Fukuoka, Japan, called Fukuoka, with mostly Korean characters, but also Japanese ones. His is a model I would like to see followed a bit more, even though he's a much more minor filmmaker than, of course, Bong Joon-ho. But there's still potential there, I would say.
Yeah, well, I guess there's differences in kind of production values and approaches to work, right? Like, one of my favorite films is the Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters, which is...
oh, yes, Paul Schrader's...
Yeah, Paul Schrader, yeah. And, I love the music. And I think there were a lot of challenges, to say the least, for the production of that with the kind of Japanese crew and just sort of some of the issues with Mishima's family. But the film itself is a masterpiece. But that is an exception, I think. Often it is challenging to kind of bridge that gap. And you do write a little bit about cinema, or quite a lot about cinema, don't you?
I do, and you bring to mind something that I was talking about just yesterday in one of my Japanese conversation classes. It's, 'tis the season, Christmas is coming. We were talking about Christmas traditions, what movies do you watch at Christmas, and I brought up a Japanese Western collaboration, well known by the name of Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, a film you might have seen with David Bowie and Ryuichi Sakamoto wearing a lot of eyeshadow as a Mishima-type figure. And, you describe that movie to someone who hasn't seen it, and it sounds just nuts. You can't make it sound like a real movie, even. You watch it, and everything fits together, as strange as it may sometimes feel. It's set in this World War II prison camp. You have these two music stars, one playing a prisoner of war, another the sort of honor-bound honor-bound overseer of the prison. You have these flashbacks where David Bowie is, I believe, supposed to be a teenager in New Zealand, but he's like 36, clearly, in the in the flashback. So in so many ways, this movie shouldn't work at all. But like many of my favorite movies, it does somehow in the end. I don't know if you have differing opinions on Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, but that is a true victory of sort of the art over the very unpromising combination of factors going into it.
Well, it's magical, right? And I mean, they do play it over here at this time of year. And actually, I think some of it was actually shot in New Zealand, in Auckland.
Oh, the flashbacks were actually shot there?
Yeah, I've been, because it's the old Auckland railway station, and I've been there, and yeah, it's, it might, actually, I think it might even be some of the tropical scenes are also shot there. I'm not sure if it was all on location, but Auckland has kind of a tropical look sometimes, yeah.
I could believe it. Since we're talking about language, it's worth noting that Tom Conti, who is the Japanese-speaking Westerner in that movie, he couldn't actually speak Japanese. He was saying every single line phonetically. He just memorized all these lines. And he sounds okay given that, but you think, wouldn't it be easier just to learn that level of Japanese at that point rather than memorizing all like 100 lines throughout a movie? But every actor has his own method. What can you say? But I do write a lot about film. Korean film was in large part what got me into Korea in the first place. I stumbled upon this trove of Korean DVDs in my university library and started watching them, and I noticed, well, these DVD boxes are all in Korean, so I should probably learn this alphabet, because somehow I knew it was an alphabet, that it wasn't ideographic, the writing system, the Korean writing system, and I knew it was supposed to be easy to learn, the alphabet, if not the language. And so I told myself, well, I'll learn to read it. I'll read these DVD boxes and I'll sort of get it out of my system. And 15 years later, here I am, living in Korea, still every day working on the language. So I sort of backed myself into it. I think on some level I knew what I was doing.
Tell us more about that, like language learning. Is that something that came to you naturally, or?
No, I didn't. I wasn't into it at all growing up, and I don't know if you guys had similar experiences, but growing up in the States, you have to do a foreign language in school. Mine was Spanish, which I liked all right at the time, but since then I've had to forget what I learned in school, or what I was taught in school about Spanish, and relearn again, from scratch. But it didn't really put the fire into me to learn foreign languages, and part of me had this delusion, labored under this delusion that if I started learning after childhood, I just figured I'm never going to get it. So why bother? So I held to that. I held fast to that for a while. But then, in the 2000s, I started podcasting and doing an interview show on the radio at that time as well in California. And I read a memoir by a professor named John Nathan. He is still around. He's a translator of Japanese literature, translated Mishima. In fact, he was Mishima's first English translator. And he happened to be a professor at the school where I graduated, the school from which I graduated, University of California, Santa Barbara. And he wrote a memoir called Living Carelessly in Tokyo and Elsewhere. So I interviewed him about that, because I had always had an interest in a fascination with Japan since childhood, as many guys our generation do because of video games or animation or what have you, comics. And reading his book, then I read other memoirs of foreigners in Japan, Westerners in Japan. Donald Keene wrote a couple of them. Edward Seidensticker, the ambassador. Edward Seidensticker, the translator, and the ambassador Reischauer, Edwin Reischauer. And, I kept reading these memoirs of Westerners going to Japan in the 50s, 60s, 70s, thinking, is it too late for me? Assuming that it kind of was. But then I realized, well, I also found this cache of Korean movies. I seem to be learning this language. Maybe one day I can at least go there for a while. And I certainly have. But yeah, these were all tied together, film and language, and the sort of Westerners who went before me to Asia. They all coalesced into one big sort of entity of motivation, you might say. But as I say, I didn't know I was going to live here until almost the year or two before I moved here. So it was a surprise in a way.
What happened after you watched those DVDs in your university library, I assume? So how did it go from that to jumping on a plane and not leaving Korea?
That's separated by about 8 years, but I was watching Korean movies and sort of slowly getting to grips with the very basics of the language. But at that time, there wasn't much in the way of materials. I checked out, old textbooks from the 1980s from the university library, But then after a couple of years of struggle with that, then podcasting really took off. And there were a few Korean podcasts I could listen to. YouTube videos came around, and so this sort of internet pedagogy started happening. So I had more material to work with. But even then, even after years, I would listen to a Korean podcast, like a podcast all in Korean, and I would catch one out of every 20, 30 words. And I don't know why I thought I was ever going to bridge that gap. But I had some belief, I guess, if I just keep listening, because I had no real prior experience mastering a foreign language, much less an East Asian one. But I just figured, I don't know anybody else learning Korean, so at least it's my thing. And it felt so individual that I sort of kept it as a private project. In that book that I mentioned, the memoir, John Nathan's Living Carelessly in Tokyo and Elsewhere, he was studying Japanese in the 60s at Harvard, and he described it as his pet monkey. It was something he just kept for himself, and he pulled it out at parties or wherever so he could impress people. I wasn't quite like that, but I understand the appeal of the pet monkey. And, I lived at that time in Santa Barbara, California, where there were no Korean classes around to take. So I took a Japanese class just because I figured I could meet Koreans there to practice with. And so I did, in fact, but I kept up with Japanese. And eventually moved to Los Angeles, where there is the biggest Koreatown in the U.S. I lived there for a few years, and at a certain point, I could sense which way things were going, and moved from Koreatown to the biggest Koreatown in the world, Seoul, and here I am. It sounds natural, it sounds logical when I explain it this way, but at the time, I wasn't sure at all that I would be actually living here, nor that I could make a genuine go of it doing so.
And I know it's a long time ago, so I don't expect you to remember exactly, but can you remember that first time that you stepped off the plane in Seoul? Do you remember? Because I sort of do. It was sort of like, it wasn't so long ago that I can remember that feeling. And it was the first time that I had really left the UK. It's the first time that I'd moved abroad, and I remember I arrived at night, and it was very magical. The smell was different. The colors were different. The light was everything. I remember I was just like overloaded with sensory excitement, I guess.
I hear you, and when before I mention what it was like to get to Seoul, I should mention I went to Japan first, briefly, to record for a few weeks to record podcasts, and I'd never been to Asia. I went to Osaka, and getting there was one thing. Then I woke up the next morning, went out to the street from my hostel, and I thought, this place looks exactly like Japan. Of course, it was Japan, but Japan looks exactly like Japan, and I think you know what I mean when I say that. But Korea, the flight got in at 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, so you're already in a state of bewilderment or disorientation. And I was staying in Gangnam, and got down to the Airbnb, went out again to get some coffee because I was aware of how many coffee shops there were in Seoul. I'd been told by Korean friends, and I skipped the first 3 coffee shops I found because they were all located inside plastic surgery clinics, and I was scared to go into them. They were there. They were serving coffee. And first of all, this is so Korean, coffee being served inside a plastic surgery clinic. And even then I knew that was, this image is going to stick with me. But I had to skip the first few because I just didn't want to make the first place I went in Korea a plastic surgery clinic in Gangnam. But that's what it was like. And, there was no culture shock because I'd been living in Koreatown. And so I was free to concentrate on other aspects, what Seoul was like as a city. And I could speak Korean enough to get around. So I had a few of the standard burdens were lifted. But in a way, right, you kind of enjoy total incomprehension when you go to a place. I sometimes I think, what would Korea be like? I wish I knew what Korea would be like fresh, knowing nothing, just never knowing a Korean, never knowing any Korean language. Just what would it feel like? And I don't know. I can't imagine. I really can't simulate it, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is a shame. I wonder if some of those foreigners in Korea don't learn Korean, so they retain a little bit of that sort of like unknowing, that magic.
It's possible. I've heard foreigners say, I deliberately don't want to learn Korean, but I can't tell if that's an excuse for not learning Korean,
I think it's
or if they genuinely feel that way. A little of column A, a little of column B, possibly.
Speaking of cities, how would you characterize Seoul as a city? Like, can you tell me more about it? What's the heart of it? What's the, I guess, in the situation as international sort of frame of reference, and something we talk about a lot here, kind of wandering through the city. What does Seoul feel like to you?
I suppose I should be able to address this because most of the writing I do is about cities. So I will gather my resources and say Seoul is not exceptional in Korea. It is exemplary. That's how Koreans see it. In the US, New York, for example, is not seen as exemplary of American culture, but exceptional. New York is an aberration, albeit a very important aberration. That's how many Americans think. In the UK, I know that London seems to be regarded as a city-state unto itself at this point. And John Cleese famously got in trouble for saying it doesn't feel English in London anymore. Whether that's true or not, I've been there only once. I couldn't tell you what it feels like in any cogent sense. London may be another of the great exceptional cities in its country, whereas Seoul, to a lot of Koreans, Seoul just is Korea. That's where half the population of the whole country is in the Seoul metropolitan area, 25 million of the 50 million. And there's a perception that if you want to make anything of yourself, you've got to get to Seoul, because you're not going to do it in any other part of the country, even any of the other major cities. So this is the most capital-centric country I've ever been to. It's more capital-centric than England, I would say, more so than France, even. And that makes Seoul a certain kind of urban experience, you could say. It's representative of many things about the country. One of them is this. When foreigners visit Korea, I often tell them to bear two questions in mind and periodically ask themselves these questions as they're exploring. Number one is, to what extent is Korea a 5,000-year-old society? And to what extent is it a sort of 70-year-old society trying to connect itself to its distant past? Another question I ask is, to what extent is Korea an Asian country, an Asian society? And to what extent is it a society in Asia trying to connect itself directly to the West? All of these things are true. All four are true in different measures at different times. But Seoul, I think, shows you all of it. It shows you what modern Korea is. It can be seen within Seoul. Tell me if you think I'm making too much of that. You've both been to Seoul. But what stands out, when you compare it to, say, Tokyo, a city you both know, what really feels different when you would come to Seoul? What was like, oh, this isn't Japan? Was there anything in particular you remember?
I came to Japan after Korea, so I didn't go back. I didn't visit. Yeah, I went the other way around. But for me, the biggest difference between Tokyo and Seoul is the general public. I feel like the general public in Tokyo are very mindful and caring, and as long as you're not on the Shibuya Scramble, for example, they're very polite and will sort of get out of your way. But my experience in South Korea was a very aggressive general public, and I would often get pushed and shoved by ajumas or ajoshis, these older Korean generations. And I remember it wasn't just a couple of times thing. It was very often I would just get shoved out of the way by some she looked like a lovely old lady walking down the road, but she was on a mission and I was in the way of her mission. Yes. That happened often, and that never ever happened to me in Japan, even though I spent longer time there. Now, if we talk about, the experience with the actual city itself, I felt like Tokyo was a little bit cleaner and quieter than Seoul. I don't ever remember going into a back alley in Seoul and finding silence. Whereas in Tokyo, you could do that. You could do that very easily. Even if you were in Shibuya, you could go a couple of rows back from the main street and you would find silence. And it would be so quiet.
You're right. I've had that experience in Tokyo. But go ahead, Cody. What was your?
Oh yeah, I am conscious. They are two different places. But my brief experience in Seoul, it was one of kind of awe in a way. I've got a good friend who, well, the Korean story is a very interesting one. I've got a friend, Tim Franco, who shot a book exploring actually North Korean defectors and sort of telling their story. And I always remember looking at that imagery and some of the work that he's done around that, and realizing that there is a much more salient and kind of stark memory there of sort of the Korean situation. And that became very clear to me when I was in the subway, which, there's very cavernous kind of large underground structures, which I understand are actually bomb shelters in a sense, very large.
Some of them are quite deep underground, it's true.
Yeah, and huge places. Which I have an image there in my mind when I got off the subway, of this huge kind of fallout shelter like subways, and then an old lady hobbled over on like a small tarpaulin trying to sell vegetables, but it wasn't a market. She was literally just in the corner there with her vegetables, cabbages and things, trying to sell that. And then I remember seeing that, and everyone just sort of walking past and thinking, there's a story here that I would love to explore and to understand more about the history of this place, because it is so much, somewhere like Taiwan, there's kind of like these little alleyways and things, and I didn't spend enough time there to really get to explore it. But I would love to know more about those places and kind of the relationship they had with the history of the city, and how the city has grown out from perhaps a central point, or sort of how it formed. I would be interested to know more about that. But yeah, overall, I felt definitely there was a very chilling effect, sort of in the atmosphere. I wasn't able to relax in the same way that I would in other places where you could just sort of fall into it. Like, I always felt I had to be kind of on my guard, and it was, sort of, as Simon mentioned, there is a little bit of this kind of aggression in the air, which was, again, coming straight from Tokyo. It was quite a different experience, but I would like to know maybe what goes into that.
I too had a similar old lady who would sit on the corner and sell vegetables near the first building I lived in here in Seoul. Even in freezing winter weather, worse than it is right now, she would be out there surrounded by her bags of vegetables. And you still see this. I mean, in Gangnam Station, there's an even older lady I see there when I pass through. And in those surroundings, you have these giant video screens showing K-pop videos, and there's this 85-year-old woman selling sprouts on the ground. That is not a vista you see in Tokyo, at least in my experience. But there's one thing to mention here is, yes, South Korea is well known for having developed very quickly since the 1960s, really since the end of the Korean War, but especially so after the 60s, industrializing fast, developing fast, modernizing, if you like, fast, or even westernizing in some respects fast. And the traces of the speed of that process are everywhere. And I think for a lot of Koreans, they'd prefer to ignore the traces of the developing world that are still visible around. So I think if you ask Koreans about these things, about the old lady selling vegetables, or if you ask them about even the sort of apocalyptic preachers with their giant signs and megaphones, you ask them, what do you think of those people? They might say, oh, it's a shame, or I don't like them, but I don't think they see them at all. And this is a point often made by long-term expats here, is you get the sense a lot of Koreans just are tuning out things that maybe bother you or stick out to you, whereas many Koreans born and raised in Seoul, they just don't see them anymore. But this developmental speed is really the speed of the development of Seoul and of Korea as a whole is one characteristic, I think, that sets here apart from, say, Tokyo. Tokyo, of course, had to rebuild itself, but I don't think it happened quite as quickly, and in some senses not quite as hastily. Japan's known for taking its time on things. Korea is not known. I mean, it's known for the opposite, the sort of pali culture. They often talk about hurry. And, for good and for ill, that still exists. And, when buildings come up as quick as they go down, and I was away for 2 months in September and October. When I got back, every day I saw one or two stores that were just gone or had changed to something else, or buildings knocked down, buildings built while I was away. It's still very rapidly, at least by American standards, very rapidly changing here. And that's maybe the signal quality to a lot of people who live here.
By English standards as well, we're very slow at, building. And so, but one thing that I did find a nice correlation between the Japanese and the Koreans was that both of them were very connected to nature. So, even the people who were living in Tokyo, or even the people living in Seoul, because nature was so physically close to them, they were often going out climbing, and they were going to the mountains and the forests around around these big metropolises. I'm not sure what the English relationship is there, or the American relationship, for example. I know in New Zealand, you're basically all nature. The whole country is nature.
Yeah, I mean, it's problematic. Like, I think New Zealand is definitely the connection with nature is difficult. Like, we live amongst it, but it's definitely a taming of nature. And that kind of Princess Mononoke kind of style relationship, that symbiotic kind of animalistic relationship with animalism kind of thing. It's not really the same here. There's very much a command and a control of nature. But I do know what you mean, though, is sort of a reverence for it, which I do not think is the case in New Zealand. As much as we would like to say that, I think generally speaking, as an agrarian country, it's not like that. We just sort of it's an extraction-based economy at the end of the day, and the extraction comes from the land.
The mention of nature reminds me, I should have mentioned one more obvious quality of Seoul, which is the mountains. Anybody who goes to Seoul seems to notice those first. First, it's the apartment complexes, the clusters of 20, 30-story towers, but then it's the mountains. And I was once asked by the Korea Times to to contribute to a series of pieces by expats talking about what they like about Seoul. And the editor who commissioned me said this first: whatever you do, don't write about the mountains, because every expat writes about the mountains. Every foreigner writes about the mountains. And to be honest, it hadn't occurred to me, because I don't go up there much, but you can go hiking by just getting on a train, getting on a subway, and it'll stop at the foot almost of the mountain. You can climb up it. And if you're an old Korean person, you have a backpack full of makgeolli or other alcohol, you're going to drink it up there. But, a lot of foreigners here will say, you ask them, what do you like about Seoul? And they'll say, it's easy to get out of Seoul. You can go away to the countryside, or you can go up a mountain, which is kind of a backhanded compliment, but it reminds me of what I heard about Los Angeles, the last city I lived in the U.S., where people would say, what do I like? Well, I can go away. I can go away from Los Angeles, and I can hike up I can go on the Santa Monica Mountains or what have you, which I never did even once. But to my mind, neither of these cities do I have any desire. I don't have any desire to get away from them. I enjoy the cities themselves, and the same is true for, I like Osaka in Japan very much, and I hope to one day do more writing about Osaka. And it's a city people complain about in the way that they complain about Seoul or Los Angeles. But I got to tell you, when I'm there, I have no desire to leave whatsoever.
Can I just ask you about your relationship with Los Angeles? Over the last 6 years, have you been able to go back much? Not counting the last 2 years, of course, but what has your relationship changed to Los Angeles at all?
I still write about it. I still write about Los Angeles books that come out. I'm still working on a book myself about Los Angeles, and it's been a while though. I was last there in 2018. And I bring up U.S. standards. By U.S. standards, it's a fast-changing city, but not by Korean standards. So it's always recognizable when I go there. But the big development now is sort of expanding the transit system, which changes the texture of the city quite a bit whenever I do go. And this book I'm doing about Los Angeles, I've got many suggestions from much bigger writers than I have, saying, you should focus on how you didn't have a car there, how you got around without a car. And I'm saying, well, first, that wasn't really a problem. And second, that's not going to be notable. It's kind of not notable now, but won't be noted. It's going to date a book very quickly if it's about, being carless, when it wasn't even, to me, a notable quality of my experience there. Los Angeles is one of the cities that intrigues me most in the whole world. Might as well admit it. And it's up there with Seoul or Osaka, or Mexico City is another one. And a friend once asked, why do you like all these enormous cities that are difficult to navigate? And hard to say. Maybe the challenge, mastering a city is itself an appealing prospect, though impossible, I realize. The idea that you can get closer and closer to mastery of a city asymptotically without ever reaching it. I like, but it got me thinking: Are there any small cities I like a lot? I'm not sure. There probably are. I just haven't gone to them enough. But have either of you been out to Los Angeles in your travels?
No, I've got a lot of friends out that way, but it was on the list. We were talking a while back about doing a road trip at some point, though, weren't we, Simon? Getting out over there and checking it all out, because so much of our kind of culture comes from that city and sort of the visual zeitgeist of everything Hollywood and all sorts. So I'd definitely be keen to check it out at some point. But I do a little bit, and this, I don't want this to sound like a cop out, but I jump on YouTube quite a lot, and I watch. There's these videos of like dash cam just driving around LA, and I find it super fascinating just looking at just the disparity. The different, you go certain parts of LA, super rich, wealthy places, and then there's other areas which are, the complete opposite, and just there's no gradation. It's like a couple of blocks over, and then it changes. I've found that very interesting.
It's true. You're suddenly in a whole other. It feels like you're in another country and stuff. You cross some invisible line, and it's like where am I again? That's one aspect of the appeal to me, I suppose.
Yeah, I do want to jump back to Korea, though, for a little bit, because I am conscious that, we're talking about this, and for me, I find this quite interesting, because we're talking about this as like Koreans and Japanese and stuff, and as I said, for me, that kind of, I kind of used to have that hat on when I was living overseas, but now I come back to New Zealand, like I find that it's almost like it doesn't matter. It's like I'm thinking about the city as the architecture and the kind of the moments and the connections between places, and it's to paint it with the broad stroke of like, well, this is a Korean thing, this is a Japanese thing. It seems almost to gloss over it, And I remember quite clearly before all of this, the lockdowns and pandemic stuff, I remember thinking, one project I'd really love to undertake would be to visit the POSCO steelworks in south. I think it's near Busan or down south at least.
Ulsan, I think.
Yeah, it's I think one of the largest steel manufacturing regions in the world, and they've got like boat manufacturing and a whole lot of stuff out there, like huge industrial areas, and kind of it seems like quite a sort of inhospitable part of the country in terms of hills and mountains and things as well. And I always think, just looking at the images of that, I thought, this would be a really interesting project, because that, in particular, POSCO, as this steel company, was really one of the drivers of the Korean economic miracle, right? Where they had this steel, some of the best steel in the world being built there at the expense of everything else. This was one of the drivers at the time, and the government really put a lot of work into making that what it needed to be. And yet it seems so banal, it's just a factory, but there's so much there,
I should correct myself. I think maybe Pohang is where most of the steelworks are. Maybe Ulsan as well. They're near each other.
Is the headquarters, but they might have the actual factories might be somewhere else.
That's possible. I haven't been down there.
Yeah, they're on the water, so they've got this sort of like the iron ore comes in one end, on the boats, and then it kind of gets made and sent out on the other side. But just the imagery of that. And the furnaces and all of that. And I mean, I'm sure it would be impossible to get access to, but just as a dream and a vision of shooting something like that as a series to kind of drive into it, because if Seoul, as you say, is this kind of exemplary city, what about the rest of it? What about the manufacturing and the kind of the rough blue tarpaulins and farmhouses and factories in the middle of nowhere that are everywhere else, because they're not necessarily
all of which I like when I travel Korea.
Yeah. I do find that very interesting. And then just kind of the connection between it, because, I remember when I was flying over there, you sort of went over a bit of the countryside, and as you say, you could see these high-rise apartment buildings as you come into land. They're very similar, and in a way remind me a little bit of the danshi from Japan. In fact, what are they called in Korean?
Danji. Rather, this is a cognate. As there are many cognates between Japanese and Korean, but apat danji, those are hated by Westerners very often. And there's a guy, Michael Booth, an English writer living in Denmark, who did a book called 3 Tigers, 1 Mountain recently, traveling in Korea, China, Taiwan, Japan, trying to get a sense of why don't these countries get along. But he has a big Korean section. and he addresses his own distaste for the apat danji of Korea. And he's thinking, why do these bother me so much? Especially, why do the numbers on the side bother me so much? Because if you've seen these buildings, they're giant, not giant, but 30-story concrete towers all together in a cluster, each labeled with a 3-digit number usually. And he says, I think it's because something so big I feel instinctively, something so big should be identifiable by its size alone. The fact that it needs a number, it means something is wrong, something is out of order there. And I understood that. I don't hate those complexes, but I can't say that I like them. But I do see what he means, right? It's something went wrong. Like there's a conceptual mismatch when you look at them. It's like something here shouldn't be like this.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a bigger question there, and I've always been fascinated by this. And as you might know, I did the book, a photo book on danshi and in Japan, and there's been something that's always fascinated me about modern architecture and concrete in particular as this kind of vernacular material for the modern world. And because you see these very same buildings not only in Korea but in other parts of the world at a certain point in their developmental history, and they all seem to follow the same blueprint. And so there was this kind of idea that kind of caught on, this contagion idea of a certain form of housing, which we even have in New Zealand, albeit a little bit earlier. The examples we have here are from the 40s and 50s, but everywhere in the world has in their own way this sort of form, or a lot of places in the world have this form of concrete architecture, public housing in a lot of cases, or private buildings, and it seems to have caught on. What are your thoughts on that?
In a way, I'm willing to almost hazard that in every city, these buildings date from when people were rushing to the city, when you had the greatest influx of population. And in Korea, that was the 1960s. In Seoul, you saw everybody coming to Seoul from the countryside. There's this word in Korean, jibang. It just means region, but effectively it means not Seoul. And from the jibang, when everybody was coming, they needed to be housed some way. And these concrete buildings could be put up quickly. And in New Zealand, I don't know, was the 40s and 50s a big time of migration from the countryside in the cities?
I think, yeah. Interestingly, the examples in New Zealand had a twofold approach. So the State House, which was the freestanding, home, sort of quarter acre, and each with a number of designs, so they didn't all look exactly the same, was one angle, and that was predominantly in the 40s. And then there were, in Wellington in particular, there were a number of these high-rise projects because Wellington has a lack of land area. And they were developed again in the 40s, sort of post-war, as the kind of things started coming back, and again people moved to the city, flocked to the city. Yeah.
So there are physical marks of the flocking to the city era, I suppose you could say. And Tokyo as well, although from what I understand, Tokyo is complicated by the Shinkansen, which effectively made Tokyo larger. It made many other cities suburbs of Tokyo, effectively, if I have that right. So you don't have quite the height of housing you do in Seoul, but you do have a greater spread if that gets it.
Yeah, well, there's a lot more land area, I think, in the Kanto region where Tokyo is, and I think the danshi, which really emerged in these kind of sleeper towns, right? So the Shinkansen, which debuted really with the Olympics in 1964, that was sort of connecting the other cities, the other regions of Japan, but definitely the commuter network, which meant that you could take these kind of commuter trains out to these sleeper towns and come back in for work, which kind of grew the boundaries of the city over time. And you see that everywhere, right? That kind of classic urban sprawl, but in this case, driven not by the automobile, but by the train network.
You do see that. Now I think of the small towns I've been to in Korea, and even these places with a population of sort of 10,000. You have the little downtown, the low-rise downtown strip, and then in the background, there's always 20, 30-story towers clustered together. Even in the countryside where there is space, you have these danji. They always sprout up in a way that looks, I assume, pretty comical to a visitor, although I've got used to them, and I expect to see them, and if I don't, now it's notable, right, if I don't see them.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting relationship between density and kind of housing. Like with New Zealand, the challenge has been, as you might be aware, we do have a major housing crisis at the moment, and the classic New Zealand desire for this sort of freestanding home, the quarter acre, even in places like Wellington, these massive old colonial mansions that have 6 bedrooms are sitting there, and you could fit on a couple of those blocks, you could fit a huge apartment block, but it's not actually possible with the zoning laws and some of the restrictions. So there's this kind of debate right now around the future of New Zealand housing, whereas that debate didn't, it was in the older days with Seoul and Tokyo. It seems like architecturally there was a lot more free-form stuff happening. Some of the stuff they got away with was just so new, and kind of the boundaries of what was possible were so new at that time that they were able to do stuff like building highways over the top of rivers and building these huge projects, which you must have seen similar stuff in Seoul and Korea. But today there's just been this kind of ossification of law and kind of building consents and all of that, so that everything has grinded to a halt. And even maybe LA would be the same.
Oh, very much so. I mean, when I scroll through Twitter, many of the people that I see on my feed are Los Angeles urbanists or Americans in other cities complaining about how zoning stops the building of housing. Los Angeles is pronounced in that way. I'm sure England has many similar problems about housing, but some of it's cultural. I assume, as you say, the desire for the quarter acre or what have you.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the other places I'd love to visit would be, the likes of Glasgow or Manchester in the UK. I would love to come to the UK as soon as I can and whatnot. But, there was this massive move again after the war to rebuild, and you had these new towns go up. And so some of the classic architecture that I'd love to go and visit, even the Barbican and places like that, this kind of concrete monoliths that were built as kind of the new vision, English socialism, post-war, and that has sort of fallen off. These places have kind of fallen out of favor, but they still stand. Again, concrete lasts, right? They
do. I'm sure you know the writing of Owen Hatherley, someone I interviewed, the architectural writer Owen Hatherley, whom I interviewed when I was in London, but he loves all this stuff too, and so he's given me, his books have given me a sort of a desire to see, how to put it, not just smaller towns, but the sort of small cities of England, the sort of Sheffields, for example, or the Southamptons, where you get these relics of the era you're talking about, where there was just so much building done to accommodate a future society that didn't really materialize, shall we say. That would be how he, I think, would put it, how Owen Hatherley would put it.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that in terms of sort of that retro futurism,
Well, I'm very drawn to it, but I think, we're all of the same generation. I think we're all a similar age. I'm 37. Owen Hatherley is a bit older, but I think we look back, for whatever reason, whatever our nationality, at least in the West, kind of fondly on that era where building reflected ideas about what society would be, rather than, now the building in the U.S., it's sort of everything's being clearly built as an investment vehicle. It's not. There's no ideas behind it. It's just sort of, can we get it built? Is it going to sell? And that's it. And that may be inevitable, but it does make you long for. You long to see some notion of the future embodied in concrete or some other material, right?
Yeah, that is fascinating. You mentioned before that this sort of concrete high-rise culture was really built as people flocked to the city. But what do you think the future holds as we move to a world of work from home? And I think, Simon, you're working from home at the moment, aren't you?
I am. I've just been asked to isolate.
Once again, back to isolation. I wonder, because we have a difference here in the way our respective countries have responded to the pandemic. In Korea, life hasn't been that disrupted. There have been no lockdowns per se in Korea. Seoul has had a bit more strictures applied to it. The capital region has, just because that's where the people are, as I say. But I don't get the sense of much work from home being done here in Korea. The most life ever got disrupted for me as a freelancer was when last year, when coffee shops were takeout only for a month or two, and that was inconvenient. I had to find the coffee shops that weren't cooperating or that were technically restaurants and do some writing there. But I do get the sense in the US or in much of the West, I just imagine everybody being at home all the time now. I could be wrong, but I haven't I haven't got a sense of how people work there in 2021. You two would know better than I would.
No, it really is like that. In the West, especially, there is a big movement to staying at home, and yes, one of the reasons for that is working from home. But also, I think a lot of people are just drained from the pandemic, and a lot of people, and sort of what everyone's talking about at the moment, is just being burnt out, and they don't want to go out as much as they used to anymore. And there is a big push for sort of like, curling up on the sofa with a blanket in a movie or something.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, Colin, because I do remember when I was living in Japan, everything that happened overseas seemed like it was so far away and it didn't matter to us here in Japan.
Right.
But now that I'm back in New Zealand, the issues here are so salient. And in a way, New Zealand culture was never really prepared for such a serious matter. I don't quite know how to explain it, but New Zealand has always been a very easygoing place, as you might have experienced when you came here, and yet we got sort of slapped with these very restrictive lockdowns. In fact, they were illegal in the first instance. They had to retroactively change the law to justify and legalize it, but we basically got locked up. And most recently, the largest city, Auckland, got locked up for 100 days. Literally police roaming the streets looking for people outside and things like that. So it's been a very shocking 2 years, and it's very much changed the fabric of society and the way the social contract. And so work from home has become very accessible for people who are of that kind of laptop class. But yeah, the essential workers are still going out, but a lot of people, are working at home. It has changed, I think, the relationship with the city. A lot of people trying to get away from the cities, moving to there's smaller towns and cities in New Zealand that people have tried to escape to, so that they don't have to go through that. But it's done is push the housing price up everywhere. So we've got $1 million as the average price now in New Zealand for a home, which is quite a lot of money.
Given the laid-back nature of New Zealanders, then, I mean, what forces were driving these harsh lockdowns?
Well, I think it was unfortunately it's a very materialistic society, and in a funny way, and potentially quite a different way to Japan and other places, where that materialism is bound up in this practicality of ownership of a home or that sort of thing. And there was this kind of attack on belonging and a lot of fear, unfortunately, a lot of fear mongering in the New Zealand media, which led to people really, being scared beyond belief and feeling like, we have to kind of like go back home, and this kind of nesting instinct emerged, if you know what I mean. So I still see it today, like that kind of jovial, classic Kiwi engagement is it's still there, but it's not quite the way it was 2 years ago. And I don't know, maybe it will come back, but there's definitely a lot of fear floating around. And I think the media has a lot to answer for that. But it's been challenging.
By contrast, I was just in the States a couple months ago. One of the places I was in was Arizona, in the Southwest, the state of Arizona. And it's 2019 there. There's no one even acknowledges that there has been a pandemic. There's no masks, nothing, which it feels different than being in Korea, where even when I was at the gym just now, and it's you keep your mask on while working out, which I'm never going to get used to that. And I was happy not to wear one when I was in Arizona, but California was stricter, not like Korea, but even Korea, there's no cops on the street telling you to wear a mask. It's just that everybody's doing it. I suspect because it's not so much altruistic as they're afraid of getting in trouble. So everyone puts it on, and okay, we'll keep it on.
Yeah, one of the challenges I think New Zealand has never really had to deal with, again, this sort of thing, every war and every major issue has always been so far away.
Yes.
And so this kind of idea of something local, and it, in a way it did start probably, pretty much 2 years ago, because there was a number of issues. We had unfortunately, a major massacre happened in Christchurch, gun violence and whatnot. And so that sort of thing was unheard of up until now. And that took place, and then just after that there's the pandemic and all of this stuff. So it really feels like it's been laid on thick in the last couple of years, and New Zealand society just wasn't ready to deal with it.
Many relationships to authority have been illuminated. Attitudes we didn't know people held have come out.
Yeah. So in terms of like just the way that relates to the city, I think there are questions now about, well, what is the future of living in New Zealand? Wellington and Auckland as the two major cities are both extremely unaffordable. There are other places to go to, but the economic incentive of working there is questionable. And the reality is that New Zealand's economy is driven by agriculture, and so what does that mean when people don't want to live where they're growing things?
It reminds me of this thing you always used to hear, this prediction you used to hear in the 90s from Wired magazine types, that one day the internet is going to get so good you'll be able to live in the cabin in the woods and do your job you're doing now. And it was always premised, the underlying premise is that you wanted to live in a cabin in the woods. You were just being stopped by insufficiently advanced technology. And that always stuck out to me as I don't know if I'm not like longing to live in a cabin in the woods. It's not my default state of where I want to be, but that was always, I'm sure you guys both heard these ideas being thrown around, like, finally I'll get to move out into the middle of nowhere. Well, I mean, I'm not the Unabomber, right? I don't feel the need to go into the forest.
Well, you mentioned, in your Twitter, you mentioned, you're a broadcaster and essayist on cities and culture. And for me, I'd question whether you can really have one without the other.
Fair enough.
Is our city's not the machine of culture and the driver of innovation?
Yeah, you do wonder what kind of culture is being produced in the sort of forest. not so much, although it's there is a sort of, I don't know. There is a rural sensibility in some culture, but I suspect that culture is also itself a product of the city, is the longing for the quintessentially urban longing for something other than the city, right? I mean, America knows that, England knows that, New Zealand, I'm sure, has it as well.
Yeah, well, I guess that's the kind of Arcadian myth of the countryside, right? And that's something I've always wondered about myself with New Zealand, its relationship to the land. What is nature and what is the countryside? There is, I mean, are you familiar with To Die in the Countryside? It's a film, Terayama Shuji, Japanese film.
I have never seen it. I've never seen that movie.
No, that's okay. I guess the idea is, again, this kind of connection to the countryside, and that, because a lot of that pre-war, that was where the kind of the folk culture emerged from, right? And then that kind of moved to the city. And so there is this folk culture that I think emerges in a lot of places, and it eventually accumulates in the city, and it comes out again as myths and kind of pop culture. But folk culture today, where does it live? I mean, what is, in terms of, say, Korea, what is the, I guess, sort of folk culture and local culture outside of Seoul look like?
There's a few different things I could say about this. There has been a revival of folk culture, often in urban settings, classical instruments like the gayagum, or even the shamanistic routines and dances. I was just at a concert at the National Museum the day before yesterday, seeing some of these put on, and there's a push to fund these things and revive them and make them visible again, or maybe more visible than they ever were in the first place in some instances. But what you said, Cody, reminded me of something that a friend of mine, an American guy in his 60s now, who's lived both extensively in Japan and Korea since the 80s, said his view of the sort of urban-rural difference in Korea and Japan was that, to his mind, Koreans, well, he said the Japanese have become an urban people. They've been urban long enough to become an urban people. Koreans are not an urban people. They just happen to live in urban environments. And whether that's right or wrong, I can't say, but it stuck with me. I go around thinking, Koreans, maybe they're still psychologically in some sense rural, but happen to be urbanites. And the Japanese, they've just become thoroughly urban at this point.
Yeah, I would be keen to hear your thoughts, Colin. Just there's two more things I would like to cover today. One would be like kind of your understanding and your thoughts on the role of social media and kind of that presentation and performance of the South in South Korea, and then also your plans for the future. But firstly, South Korea. Social media and that kind of connection with the device. How does it work over there, and what's it like?
Well, Koreans are known worldwide as phone addicts. I think everybody who comes back from Korea mentions on the subway how much they're staring at their phones. And, you're on a train in Korea, in Seoul these days, and everybody is on their phone. But I do keep up with Korean social media to the extent time allows, because you can observe many changes in the Korean language. There's so much slang and so much new slang. The rate of slang change and creation is very high here, and Korean Twitter is one way to keep up with it. But I did see something funny on Korean Twitter. There was the guy posting it wrote, it was like a test question about the reason that foreigners in their own countries, in Europe or the US or whatever, the reason foreigners don't use their phones on the trains, on the subway. One reason, a reason marked as incorrect, was because they value slow analog life. The reason marked correct, their phones don't work underground.
Yeah, that's 100% it. That's 100%.
Yes. But this gets at something important, is that many Koreans, I don't know many, but there are Koreans who go abroad to Europe or wherever. They see people not on their phones on the train and think, oh, these people are happy. They're not on social media. They're not miserable like us. And I think many Koreans hold dear the idea that Koreans are miserable, and that Europeans or Americans or whomever, when they think about these people, those people are happier. So it's, I think, the West is somewhat complicit, because I think the West also values the image that the Japanese and Koreans are miserable, because often, if an American goes to Japan or Korea and sees everything working, infrastructure better than there was in America, you think, well, they've got to be miserable. They've got to be paying for this somehow, right? Obviously, life must be bad here. If the actual physical structures around me are good, everything else must be bad. But also, among Koreans, there's just a lot of... The perceptions of life in the West are essentially fantasy for the most part. And there's plenty of bad aspects of Korean life, it's obvious, but it makes them feel that much worse when they think that everybody's, there's this thing about Denmark now, that Koreans hold it up as the happiest country in the world. What can we learn from Denmark? Or I was interviewing a figure very highly placed in the Korean cultural bureaucracy a while back, and he said flatly, Sweden, look at Sweden. Everybody in Sweden speaks Swedish, and then they all speak good English, so Korea should be like that. And I'm thinking, well, Sweden is in Europe, and the population is 10 million. This is not a suitable comparison. But here in Korea, there's a tendency to compare Korea to wherever makes Korea look bad, and with predictable psychological results. And social media, it amps it up. There's much talk about Instagram all over the world and how it makes people unhappy when they view their friends' lives on Instagram. I have Instagram, but only to use it as a kind of email, because most Koreans are on it. So I can contact, interviewees that I want through Instagram. But, seeing the behavior, seeing how people actually look at Instagram and the feelings that arise as a result of it, I'm not sort of scrambling to look at my own feed, shall we say. So Korea does provide a lot of cautionary examples about social media use. I would prefer not to go down the road I see many Koreans go down. It's true. I would guess it's a little more laid back in the UK or in New Zealand. It's not quite so intense, right?
Yeah, I do. I think there's something really interesting there, and I would like to find out a little bit more about that. Just that idea of the misery of the sort of seeing oneself, kind of, in almost this masochistic kind of thing, right? And definitely, I can connect with that in terms of kind of the Japanese aesthetic, and then kind of how it is all drawn from this kind of idea of suffering, right? And that might seem a bit strange to listeners, but really, I think the core of all Japanese art can be drawn from that. It's not coming from this kind of euphoric place. It's very much this kind of tough, miserable existence that leads to these beautiful moments that are like the cherry blossoms just for a moment, But yeah, New Zealand, it is difficult because again, it's so laid back. We don't have the cultural apparatus to kind of understand that. And so I've always thought, it's kind of lacking. It hasn't been activated. It's like making bread without yeast. And it becomes very challenging. And I find this very difficult to connect with New Zealand culture sometimes, because it's like, what is this place about? There's not this driving artistic, aesthetic thing that you can feel everywhere that permeates society. It's almost just like, well, it's what it is, and you really have to go looking for it or bring it with you,
You do have to. I mean, I have these thoughts when I visit Canada. I'm a somewhat frequent visitor to Canada now. My girlfriend has family in Canada. And Canada is so famous as an uninteresting country. Almost, that is its identity in some sense. But it is fascinating to me that Canada is undefined. Canada doesn't really have an idea, and nor really much of anything else to base itself on, other than not being the United States in certain sort of minor distinctions. So the question of what Canada is, it just goes unaddressed, which is a fascinating way to run a country, especially one of that increasing sort of prominence. But New Zealand may be similar. It's how to put it. There was an American novelist, Lionel Shriver, known for her sort of controversial opinions, but at the same time, she has a perspective on the U.S. that is distinctive. She lives in England and has for a while, and she says, most countries are just places. America has an idea, which I guess is that is something valuable. But sometimes I think, well, even America is not place enough at some point. Korea is almost 100% place. It doesn't really have an idea. America is more idea than place. I don't know. New Zealand, it sounds like it's more place than idea, yes?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It's a place, and I've really struggled personally and artistically to kind of create work here, but I do, what I have found as an effective method is to take kind of this hat of that Japanese aesthetic suffering to give it a name and carry that with me when I'm trying to create and photograph. I've been working on this series of New Zealand houses, and in a way that is a lens for uncovering what is actually 100 years of very, very much a difficult relationship with the land. This country and its bicultural roots are very much under the microscope at the moment, but every fracture in society emerges from that relationship between the people of this land, and so it's this kind of collective amnesia in a way, which no one seems to see because it's so formative to the country itself. But yeah, I am keen to hear a little bit more about what your plans are for the future, Colin, and sort of what's next for you.
I do a lot of writing and a lot of language studying, so I will be. I've for the past 6 years written a Korea blog for the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the Los Angeles Review of Books blog itself, of which that was a subset, ends at the end of this year. So I'll be doing more ambitious Korea pieces for the Los Angeles Review of Books down the line. And as I say, the Los Angeles book as well. But after that's done, I think a book on Seoul may well be in order. There are good books on Tokyo, but they're all from the 70s and 80s. And Seoul has had no good books in English written about it that are not travel guides. So I'm strongly considering what could go into that. So much of my writing is city-based, and I do a Substack newsletter about city books that others have written. So it's the logical next step to focus on particular cities to continue writing about. And I would like to, when I can resume going back and forth between Japan and Korea, as I did before, to do that again. But who knows when Japan will reopen again? Maybe you have information I don't, but this is a don't hold your breath situation, I suspect.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be anytime soon. I think they were seriously considering closing the borders for even Japanese citizens who are outside of the country.
Oh my.
So it's pretty tough. I think at the moment, it's closed for all foreigners, even those with visas. Not 100% sure on that part, but they're doing it as a sort of like rolling basis. So they're doing it up until the end of December at the moment. The borders are closed, and then they'll review it. But as we saw with the Olympics and how many times they sort of like kept saying we're going to do it, and then we're not going to do it, we're going to do it, and I think Japan might take a few more maybe 6 more months to have a breather. And
that's one thing I like about Korea versus Japan is just Korea's had the 2-week quarantine upon reentry and all that, but you can get out of that now, and I don't see Korea closing itself to foreigners entirely. It's just impossible to imagine. Whereas Japan that's been their identity. It was before the late 19th century. It was being closed. And Korea was closed for a while too, but modern Korea is so tied up with the rest of the world, and particularly the West. It's almost like that's a form of suicide if Korea were to really close hard. But Japan is self-sufficient in ways that a lot of other countries are simply not.
And they can get away with it, so they do.
They can get away with it, indeed.
Yeah. Well, it's actually, I'd like to ask you where people can find more of your work, Colin, because you are such a prolific writer, and I've gone really far back in your archives. I found some really interesting stuff. You wrote this fantastic article about Ozu. It was, I think, back in 2012. It was like really long ago. You wrote this.
Yeah, it's been a minute since I've written about him.
Yeah, you were talking about his pillow shots and how sort of, he's the most Japanese of all Japanese directors.
Well, I should say I was quoting Donald Ritchie saying that, but I agree with Donald Ritchie when he says that.
Yes, but this is what I actually wanted to talk about, because if you go down into the comments on that post, so for everybody listening, if you search for Colin Marshall and go an introduction to Yasujiro Ozu, there is this fantastic, I don't even know, story happening in the comments of this post. It's wonderful. So
I've never read the comments. It would be news to me too.
Have you not read them?
No, they're not for me. They're for the commenters, people. Right? They're for each other, aren't they?
So for the listeners, this article is just all about the film director Ozu, and Bradley Elfman says on February 6th, 2013, instead of quoting experts who are full of nonsense like Ozu as the most Japanese filmmaker, he just goes on to say, don't say these cliche things about Ozu. Why don't you watch his movies and simply write your own response? Which is, it's a silly comment. Anyway, the best thing is how this takes a twist here, where Maggie Elfman posts a reply and says, Bradley, this may seem like an odd spot to find you, but it sounds like you. If you are 72, you may be my brother. Your name and phone, which I have not had the nerve to dial, kept popping up on my contacts yesterday. I took this as a sign or a kick in the rear to contact you today. If you are the one, you are the last of my immediate family. If not, please excuse me. It sounds like spam, but I think it's real.
This is quite a story.
So that was in 2013. And then in 2015, somebody says, Maggie, I need to know, is he your brother? I'm wishing you all the best. And then Chris in 2016 says, 2016, and still no closure. Seems kind of relevant to Yasujiro Ozu's movies.
Wow, this is something. This post was on Open Culture, a site I've been writing for nearly 10 years, and they have a very wide readership. So I'm not surprised that in the comments you would see this kind of thing happening. That story is impressive, I will say. Most of the comments are just people fighting with each other, so that's why I usually don't see them. But this is something else. This is a treasure.
It's so wonderful. It should be saved in the Internet Archive. But yes, sorry, going back to my question, please, how can people find you on the internet?
There's a website, colinmarshall.org, and then Twitter, @ColinMarshall. Everything can be found through there. Those are the main venues I use, my own site and then Twitter. But yep, it's Colin Marshall at either one.
Nice.
Excellent. Well, so thank you so much for your time. It was good to catch up. I've got probably a little bit more watching and reading to do. You've sort of spurred me off. I've got some notes here around some of these people that you've mentioned, so I'm going to investigate that a little bit more. But it's definitely got me thinking about South Korea, and again, a place I haven't thought about in a little while. So it's been super interesting to get your thoughts on that. Thank you.
I'm glad to hear it, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's been very nice chatting.
Yeah, it's been a wonderful chat. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Colin. All right, catch you later.
Thank you.
Take care.